This is just a sample of the audiobook. To get the complete audiobook, access the link posted in the first comment.
Although O'Brien and Thomas fired on the attacking masses with canister, the Kentucky and Illinois men were soon obliged to give ground and to seek shelter in a nearby deep, slanting depression. All of the Americans forced into that declivity who were unable to scramble to the safety of Captain Washington's battery were killed by musket fire from the gorge's rim or by the bayonets of their opponents. At the same time, a portion of that massive enemy column was advancing down the plateau toward the outpost where Taylor was directing the movements of his troops. No infantry or cavalry being immediately at hand, only the artillery under Lieutenants O'Brien and Thomas stood in the way of the attackers. But Taylor had summoned to the plateau Bragg's battery and the rest of Sherman's, as well as the Mississippi and Indiana regiments and the dragoons. Though he lost 2 more guns and was himself wounded, Lieutenant O'Brien, with the assistance of George Thomas, held off Santa Anna's horde long enough to permit Bragg's, Sherman's, Davis's, and Lane's men to reach Taylor's plateau position, although not before the general, who characteristically sat calmly on his horse, Old Whitey, in the midst of the fighting, had his clothes torn and riddled with bullets. With the unlimbering and firing of Bragg's and Sherman's guns, the enemy's whole column finally faltered a moment, then gave way. Thereafter the American forces were shifted about somewhat, but by sunset the Battle of February 23rd was essentially over. At its conclusion, the 2 armies were left standing almost upon the same ground where they had respectively stood the night before. That evening, Taylor's troops were again compelled, for the most part, to bivouac without fires, inasmuch as it was assumed the conflict would be renewed the next day. Instead, they found that Santa Anna had withdrawn all of his forces overnight to Agua Nueva. General Taylor would inform the Adjutant General that 267 American troops, including 28 officers, were killed on the 23rd, 456 men were wounded, and 23 were missing. The enemy's casualties were estimated to number at least 1,500 and possibly 2,000. 500 of their dead were left upon the field of battle. Brevet promotion would be awarded to 19 of the officers who would have a prominent role in the Civil War. Among them were artillerists Braxton Bragg, Brevet Lieutenant Colonel, George Thomas, John Reynolds, and Thomas Sherman, Brevet Majors, and Samuel French, Brevet Captain. Bragg would also benefit particularly from the endlessly repeated but unlikely story, or various versions thereof, that his outstanding effectiveness at Buena Vista was associated with General Taylor's having instructed him to employ, in the firing of his cannon, a little more grape, one of several types of ammunition then in use that consisted of a cluster of balls bound between wooden blocks and that enabled the shot to spray the area. Perhaps because the Americans came so very close to losing the Buena Vista battle, they tended to regard it as a monumental achievement. Lieutenant John Reynolds wrote his sister Jane that Buena Vista had been the greatest battle yet, even tougher than Monterey. Brevet Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Mansfield termed it the greatest ever fought by Americans.